A couple of weeks ago, I was studying with our two upcoming bar mitzvah boys. We only have two in the next few months. Amazing, bright, engaged kids. Isaiah and Morris. And we were studying last week's Parsha, because it was 2 weeks ago, and we were studying the Ten Commandments. And when we were sort of trying to put together, without looking at the book, the list, and we came to the fourth commandment, and which of course is Zachor et Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho, remembering Shabbat, and we started studying it together. As we went through it, and it says, all of your animals and your servants, male and female, will keep Shabbat. They were both like, what? Judaism says you can have slaves? That's outrageous. I didn't know that. And even though we actually chant that every week at Kiddush, 6 days you should work and do your labor. 7th day is going to be a Shabbat for you. Don't do any kind of work. You and your children and your male slaves and your female slaves. And they had never really paid attention to it before, and they were horrified that Judaism would talk about having slaves. And then we talked about it a little bit, and then I'm thinking, like, in this week's Parsha, if they were here, they're probably skiing because it's President's Weekend, they would be even more, I think, amazed and perhaps horrified to see what actually happens to those slaves. The way that they are referred to absolutely explicitly as the property of the slave owner in this week's Parsha, right? And then right after, just as we're beginning to digest the fact that, slavery, that was a thing then, and Jews owned slave, or the ancient Israelites owned slave, we then get to all of these capital cases. And if they were here, they'd be saying, what? Judaism believes in capital punishment? But doesn't the Ten Commandments say, and they actually said this, doesn't the Ten Commandments say, thou shalt not kill? And so, I think when we confront this Parsha, which is so beautiful in so many ways, this Parsha in terms of what it is asking us to do, we have to look honestly at the pieces of this Parsha that are really difficult, and then try and unpack them a little bit. And so the idea that there is slavery, clearly something that existed in the ancient world, that there is clearly a sense of capital punishment, that we have the notion that is expressed, which of course is so well known, which is ayin tachit ayin, shein tachit shein, right? An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And some of us remember the famous saying by Mahatma Gandhi, who said if we lived like that, we would all be blind and toothless, right? And so the idea of the way in which our Torah expresses these particular ideas and what we do with them. And then perhaps, and we didn't actually read it today, but it's in this week's Parsha, perhaps the most horrifying part of all, which says very explicitly that anybody who doesn't practice the same religion as you should smash all of their idols and all of their places of worship. So here we are in this beautiful Parsha, which we can talk about in terms of empathy and compassion, and I'm going to, in terms of empathy and compassion. But before we can start talking about empathy and compassion, we have to confront the reality of what some of our tradition has and how it has evolved, right? So on that, wait. Okay, what?
The empathy that we should show.
Wait, can I finish what I'm saying? Then we can maybe open it up a little bit. I'm feeling quite thrown right now. No, it's okay. It's okay. I've lost my train of thought. I've been making a series of podcasts with my good friend Reverend Pedro Silva, who's an African American pastor and we've become really good friends, and in the process of making podcasts together, I think our relationship has, I hope some of you have heard some of them, but we made one all about, which was called The Cloak of Shadows, which was all about darkness and the idea that you can't really have creativity without darkness. And we talked about the whole idea of denial of shadow And I actually cut it all out of the podcast because we talked a lot about the shadow of Christianity and the shadow of Judaism, and how when we deny our shadows, it's when it gets most dangerously. So I think this is part of our shadow, is to look at what we've come from, what the ancient Israelite religion was that we grew out of, how the rabbis reinterpreted it, right? And then I think, on this Black History Month, when we're talking about racism and with the acknowledgement, some of you may have either read the book or seen the film or both, the amazing book by Brian Stevenson, Just Mercy, which talks about the disproportionate number of black men who are on death row in the southern states, and how that's part of this system that we are heirs to. So I think I want to say a few words, and then we can open it up and see if people have other things to say. But I wanted to just talk about these two ideas of slavery on the one hand and capital punishment, and then look a little bit later at the Parsha and how we might come to a point of reconciling these notions that we see in the Torah. So I think I'm going to start with capital punishment. In 2022, 18 men were executed in this country in capital cases, which is actually lower than it's been for a while. And it was the 8th consecutive year with fewer than 30. Before that, the numbers were much, much higher. And if you want to know them by state, they were all in the South. Texas, Oklahoma, each executed 5 people. Alabama executed 2. Mississippi executed 1, and Arizona executed 3, and Missouri executed 2. Just to get a sense of these figures. Now, if you contrast that with what Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says in a famous statement in the Mishnah, he says that, first of all, there's a whole discussion about what a capital case looks like. And a capital case can only be decreed by the Sanhedrin, which is like the Supreme Court of the day, really. It can only be tried and someone can be found guilty of a capital crime by a Sanhedrin. And then there were all of these examples of like how impossible they tried to make that. And then it concludes with this statement by Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who says, any Sanhedrin that institutes the death penalty one time in 70 years is a bloody and barbarous Sanhedrin, right? So this is a kind of like very clear case that the rabbis were trying to eliminate the death penalty from the books. They really were. And you could say the same about slavery, by the way. And so I think that this idea that we have to look at the past, but we recognize the ways in which it has evolved. And I think there are many, many, many people in the Jewish community who are involved in death penalty action and trying to eliminate the death penalty for good in every state. It's still legal in quite a few states, as we know, but the numbers are decreasing. But I want to jump forward a little bit, because if we look at the section that I read, where we talk about this idea that I just mentioned of ayin tachat ayin, shein tachat shein, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. The rabbis of the Talmud make it very clear that we're not meant to be poking each other's eyes out and extracting each other's teeth, right? They say what? It's compensation. They say straight away in the Talmud, they say this was never actually done, it was never meant to be done in a literal way, it was never meant to be taken literally, it was always about monetary compensation and about working out like the different losses that people would incur depending on their circumstances by the loss of an eye or a tooth or a hand or whatever it might be. And so it was like a real corrective to the Torah, or not a corrective but an interpretation, which all goes to show that you can't really understand what Judaism is and how Judaism evolved if you just look at the Torah. And I think a lot of the time we just read the Torah at face value and we say, I got to be part of this religion. But we are all heirs of rabbinic Judaism. We're not heirs of biblical Judaism. We're not, there was one guy who wrote a book called Living Biblically. Some of you may have read that book, which is a preposterous book living biblically. He lived a whole year according to I can't remember the guy's name. I think he's from Colorado actually. But like this idea that that's not Judaism. Judaism, as we've inherited it, is rabbinic Judaism, so it needs the interpretation. So yes, we can read these parts of the Torah that seem horrifying to us, but we look at how they've been interpreted for 2,000 years. And so if the rabbis on the one hand are saying we were never supposed to be poking each other's eyes out, and on the other hand that any court that tries a capital case and finds them guilty once in 70 years is barbarous and bloody, then clearly the rabbis are trying to eliminate those things. I think it can also be said that the same is true of slavery. And in Black History Month, when we're thinking about Black history, obviously a crucial part of understanding Black history is understanding the horrific history of slavery in this country and how in some ways we're still profiting from it, right? And so all of these things kind of exist in the Torah. And what's so wild to me is that a lot of the ways in which we talk about this parsha are actually, a lot of the essays that I've read this week and the commentaries I've read this week are saying that Mishpatim is all about empathy. Why is it all about empathy? Because it says twice, do not oppress the stranger. It talks about this idea that if you see your enemy's animal, your enemy's donkey, like struggling, overloaded, you have an obligation to help out. Your enemy's donkey. It's like saying that, the whole idea of wanting to schadenfreude, of wanting to see your enemies suffer, is really not Jewish. It's not okay. In a society, you have to help out. You have to lend a helping hand. You can't let someone who doesn't have any clothes, if you've borrowed an article of clothing for a security, you have to return it to them before night because that's what they have to keep them warm, right? All of these examples throughout Mishpatim are trying to cultivate empathy in the Jewish world, right? And yet, you would say, well, what about the slave? What about someone who's tried of a capital case? What about someone who practices another religion? And all of these categories that seem to appear where I'm just wondering, where's the empathy? Where's the empathy in telling a slave who's worked for you for 6 years on the 7th year that if they got a wife that you gave them, the wife stays and the kids stay and you got, where's the empathy in that, right? And what is empathy anyway, is one of the questions. So I want to just tell you about the last person to be executed in December of 2022 in the state of Mississippi. His name was Thomas Edwin Loden Jr. He was 58 years old. And Loden, who was a former U.S. Marines Corps recruiter, said over and over again how remorseful he was. He never denied his crime. He murdered someone called Gray, who was soon to be a high school senior. And he said he knew he could never take back the heartbreak he caused by killing the teenager. But what really moved me about his story is in his final words, he said, "For the past 20 years, I've tried to do a good deed every single day to make up for the life I took from this world." He said, "I know these are mere words and cannot erase the damage I did. If today brings you nothing else, I hope you get peace and closure." Those are his last words. How can we not feel empathy for this man? I never knew this story until yesterday, but how can we not feel empathy for this man, Thomas Edwin Loden Jr.? I feel like I want to say his name over a couple of times. No one is pretending that he's innocent, but did he really deserve to die by lethal injection in the state of Mississippi? And so I think that the Torah and the rabbinic institution is saying, no, absolutely not, he did not. And that we, as a tradition, so believe in the possibility of teshuvah, the possibility of repentance. And that, yes, he could have served out the rest of his life in prison, But I think this is really, really important for us to consider in a parsha where we think about empathy. The word that is used, and some of you know that this concept, either in the negative about not oppressing or in the positive of actually loving, the ger is mentioned 36 times in the biblical tradition, in the Torah. 36 times, some version of either do not oppress the stranger or love the stranger is said. And so if that's not an invitation for us to recognize, but we have to broaden the categories of who the ger is. Rabbinic tradition says a ger is someone who's converted to Judaism. The verb root, lagor, means to sojourn or to dwell in a temporary sense. You're not a permanent resident. It's like an undocumented person in a way, in a society. But like the idea that we are restricting them to people who are within some form of the Jewish community, and that's the ger for whom we have to have compassion, is horrific to me. The ger has to be an expanded category. It has to include people who practice other religions. It has to include our African American brothers and sisters in this month of Black History. It has to include people who have different types of ability and different diverse ways of, like I spoke about last week with neurodiversity. It has to include Jews and non-Jews. It has to include people in the LGBTQ plus community. It has to include all of those categories. It has to include anybody who I don't identify with. And the whole point of empathy is saying, like, try and identify with this person. Try and understand what their world is like that is so different to your world. If you're white, try and imagine what it's like to be black. If you're straight, try and imagine what it's like to be gay. If you're a man, trying to imagine what it's like to be a woman. That's what empathy is. And as a culture right now, we're failing at it. Rabbi Shai Held says in this amazing essay that he wrote on this parsha, he quotes a literature scholar who I'd never heard of before called Elaine Scary, who says, the human capacity to injure other people is very great precisely because our capacity to imagine other people is very small. What an amazing quote, right? I'm going to read it again. The human capacity to injure other people is very great precisely because our capacity to imagine other people is very small. Yes, the Torah is talking about some really difficult things about what we do with other religions who practiced a different form of spiritual worship. Yes, it is telling us about a culture of owning slaves, and yes, it is telling us about capital cases, but I would love to believe that what it's really telling us is to find ways to open our heart to understand the person who we have defined as a ger, as an other, whoever that other may be, wherever they find themselves, whoever they love, whatever they look like, whatever they believe, whatever they practice. And I think that's what Parshat Mishpatim is asking us. I said before we read the Parsha that Mishpatim is sometimes translated as statutes or ordinances or judgments or rules or laws. But I said that Rabbi Shefer Gold translates it as impeccabilities. Impeccabilities. The Parsha is asking us to behave in an impeccable way in our relationships with other people. The laws of damages is actually a really good example. If we own something, we have a responsibility to think about the impact of what we own might have on others. If someone is going to be injured by our property, we have to be honest about that, and we have to be scrupulous and impeccable about how we protect it from public spaces, even on our own spaces. And so all of these things that the Torah is teaching us, I think it just comes back to empathy. I heard, I was at an event with Rabbi Shmuley Yankelevich, whose name I can never say, a couple of weeks ago in Denver, and he quoted a study that said that our capacity as a culture for empathy in the last 2 decades has gone down very, very significantly, and that he was suggesting that our tradition is inviting us in a very deep way to reopen ourselves to the possibility of understanding the other, of not oppressing someone who we have othered because they are actually part of our neighborhood, part of our culture, part of our society, and part of our world. Shabbat Shalom. Did you want to say anything?
Well, when we were talking about this young man being kind of upset, I'm sorry, it just made me immediately think that there was a compassionate version of this. And first of all, it's really amazing to be here in this outwardly compassionate shul. I mean, Maya and I go to a lot of shuls, and we could absolutely feel your guys' intention on being warm-hearted and inclusive and compassionate. And I study a decent amount of Torah, and I always try to look for where's the compassion in this, because I feel Hashem's very compassionate. And in this situation where we're breaking down the pillars and the idols of these people, I think the very compassionate way to look at it is that if we act as really good Jews and show the world that what we're doing is so beautiful and so the right thing, that we're breaking down the proverbial pillars, because their religion is based, if it's based on thought first, everything comes into thought, concept. And if people accept our concepts and see that we're doing it through our compassion and through our actions, that we are breaking their idols. We're breaking their pillars down. We're not doing it walking into their place, like, hey, you jerk, and doing this. And then the concept of the slave would be like saying that, it was very compassionate in the sense that if you had a bed, your slave couldn't get a bed that was worse than your bed, and a slave didn't have a bed, you had to give that slave a pillow. This is for a Jewish slave. Yeah. But the rules around slave, I would say, we could almost look at it closer as like a worker, for a long period of time that we have to respect. But I look at it, slavery is, this concept exists, and if we are a slave to Hashem, and I look at myself as a proud slave to Hashem, he is my master, and I'll do what he says. And I don't want to be a slave to a man or a corporation or a woman or a building or anything like that, but I feel like that maybe this is an allegory in this whole slavery thing, that when the person should want to stay because he's been touched by Judaism, and we're just really hoping that he stays and becomes a Jew and lives a Jewish life when he's a Canaanite, and this is to hopefully influence him to stay. And this concept of keeping his wife maybe is just, no one's going to leave their wife if they're a good person, and then they're going to be closer to Judaism. So it's all a compassionate way to bring people closer to God in the big picture. Maybe it doesn't seem that way in the beginning.
Just real quick, Marilyn and I previewed a film called The Case for Kindness yesterday, because ABL is going to be sponsoring it. It is going to be shown at the International Film Festival, I think March 6th at Boulder High. And the reason I want to bring it up is exactly what you said about empathy. They interviewed a woman, a mother, whose son was killed at Sandy Hook. And rather than harbor bitterness and hatred, she researched the life of the perpetrator and found unbelievably horrible stuff that he went through. Yeah. It did not justify what he did, but it explained it. And why wasn't that intervention done way before? And I think if you do that in a lot of these cases, I really encourage you to see it. It's a very powerful film, but it just fits in with how important empathy is.
All right, thank you guys. I think we should finish up our service and eat some Turkish and Syrian food and think of, how can we not, we're so, I meant to say that, we're so desensitized to this world. How much empathy can we really have for these 41,000 people whose lives have been lost in an earthquake? It's just so, but that's what our world, our Torah is asking us to imagine what it would be like to be a family who's just lost a bunch of people in an earthquake right